This past Divine Mercy Sunday, during the 8 a.m. Mass at my home parish, the congregation was treated to a mixed bag of a sermon. The high notes were the priest's emphasis on God's love and mercy. However, these hopeful points were contextualized by a disturbingly transactional approach to salvation theology, which ultimately characterized Catholicism as a hell avoidance scheme. The rather stern but well-meaning priest, let's call him Father D, began his homily by describing the sacrament of confession as a spiritual fire escape given to us by Jesus through his apostles, and he extolled the good Lord's mercy, hoping to encourage more people to go line up at the confessionals. He then said, "If there were a perfect way to die, today's the day." Father D then went on to describe the plenary indulgence made available to those who made a good confession and worthily received Holy Communion. Now, a brief aside for those who may be unfamiliar with the concept of indulgences. Essentially, when we sin, we do damage to our souls. The analogy I remember from the catechism of my youth is that each sin is like driving a nail through a wooden board. The sacrament of penance removes the nails, but the holes remain. Temporal punishment in this life, or in the next through purgatory, is administered to repair the damage and pay the debt. However, the damage from a single mortal sin, unconfessed, is enough to warrant eternal, not merely temporal punishment. The plenary indulgence made available during Divine Mercy Sunday would grant the remission of all temporal punishment due to sin, whether mortal or venial. Father D called this indulgence a clean slate, akin to a second baptism. It's a grace entirely undeserved, and upon receiving it, we should strive not to rack up any more temporal punishment through sin. Quoting from St. Faustina's diary, Jesus said, "The feast of mercy emerged from my very depths of tenderness. Mankind will not have peace until it turns to the fountain of my mercy." Generally speaking, this is perfectly fine Orthodox Catholic theology. We are sinners who frequently miss the mark and are in need of mercy from God as well as from one another. But it is upon deeper inspection that we uncover a rather problematic and even dark underbelly of the salvation framework. As Father D contended, death after the reception of a plenary indulgence would be the best situation, and this understanding of humanity's predicament reduces the journey of faith to focusing on a supernatural scoreboard and hoping to optimize the spiritual circumstances of one's death. It is not about living fully, but dying well in a technical sense that involves an approach to prayer and devotion, which bears a striking resemblance to the superstitious practices of other cultures. There were a couple of other unsettling parts of Father D's sermon. Quoting again from St. Faustina's diary, Jesus said, "The person of the priest is only a screen. Never analyze what sort of priest I am making use of." On its own, this statement is fairly unproblematic. In a way, it actually humanizes priests, reassuring us that they are very much on the same difficult road that we walk. They merely act as a mediator between lay persons and Christ. However, this could spiral into a dangerous power imbalance, which is supported by the words of St. Faustina, who said, "I have come to know the great intimacy which exists between Jesus and the priest. Jesus defends whatever the priest says, and often complies with his wishes, and sometimes makes his own relationship with the soul depend on the priest's advice. This rather disturbing description makes it seem like Jesus is a mafia boss, and the priests are his enforcers, who could exercise an undue level of control and manipulation over the spiritually vulnerable. It makes salvation a hostage situation, where we are to be entirely subject to the priest's authority. Even Jesus allegedly defers to the will of the priest." The other part of the homily that felt very strange, but should actually be quite predictable for a traditional priest such as Father D, was that he only listed mortal sins relating to sex. He mentioned sinful addictions to matters pertaining to impurity, unchastity due to being in an unhealthy or toxic relationship, the inability to guard your eyes and mind regarding sins on the screen, a euphemism for pornography, not having your marriage blessed by the church and only being civilly married. Noticeably absent were slander, wrath, the abuse of workers' rights, racism, the mistreatment of migrants, and so much more. Now, to be absolutely clear before overly zealous folks in the comment section accuse me of heresy, I am not denying the reality of sexual sin. But traditionalists' utter obsession with sex and their tendency to take it out of the context of a network of many other moral problems and variables distorts the message of Christianity. At the heart of the gospel, according to Jesus, is the love of God and of neighbor. And when speaking about who enters the kingdom of God in the Gospel of Matthew, it is quite evident that Christ prioritized the corporal works of mercy, such as feeding the hungry and sheltering the homeless. Father D. warned that none of us know how much time we have left in this life, but assured us that his intention was not to scare anyone, but simply to prepare them. Despite his good and sincere intentions, Father D. is perpetuating a problematic understanding of our relationship to the divine. This legalistic approach to faith is among my core issues as I reevaluate everything I was raised with. The pursuit of virtue and the avoidance of evil is no longer about living abundantly, but escaping divine retribution through what is effectively a type of ritual magic, though because it has the stamp of the Church's approval, we do not regard it as such. This sort of pharisaical preoccupation with technicalities seems to be what Jesus railed against. Say what you will about Martin Luther, but the Protestant Revolution was largely rooted in a valid criticism of the Church's sale of indulgences, a literal buy-your-way-into-heaven transactional salvation framework. For indulgences were given in exchange for worldly riches in the medieval times. Now it seems that the remission of temporal punishment is sometimes sold at an even higher price than money. It is bought with your freedom and sanity, as you constantly try to run calculations about the state of your salvation, which is something that can never be entirely known. You can only submit intellect and will to the institutional church and be a slave of sorts in exchange for the forgiveness of your spiritual debt while hoping for God's mercy. Is this a religion of love or a spiritual insurance plan?